Whenever somebody talks about the worst game in the Jak and Daxter series, there's really only one answer: The Lost Frontier. Whether it's the tedious flying missions, the inconsistent story, or simply the fact that Naughty Dog didn't make it, this game has been ripped apart by the fans for years. But recently I was reading through some of the comments on my videos where people were saying they actually enjoyed this game, and it got me thinking, maybe I've been a little too harsh on it. So I replayed the entire game to see whether The Lost Frontier is truly a terrible game, or if it's just a decent game crushed under the weight of an impossible legacy. The Lost Frontier was the final Jak and Daxter game we ever got. Originally developed for the PSP before being ported to the PS2. It was handled by High Impact Games, and we know that Naughty Dog had some involvement in this game, but it was quite limited. I played the PSP version back when I was a youngling, and I actually remember playing it quite a bit, but coming back to it now as an adult, probably the first thing that struck me was how much this game copies the structure of Jak 3. Think about it, you travel from story mission to story mission using different vehicles across various open environments. But whereas Jak 3's Wasteland felt intentional and interesting to explore, the Lost Frontier's world feels really empty and uninspired. You spend massive chunks of time just flying from place to place with nothing really happening. Jak 3 did this so much better in my opinion, and I don't think you can talk about the Lost Frontier without talking about its movement. The original Jak trilogy is legendary for having the butteriest, smooth movement from any of the platforming giants of the PS2. The movement was fast, responsive, and it really did just feel great to use. Yet somehow, the Lost Frontier just could not replicate this feeling. They kept the same basic moveset, the punch, the spin, for some reason not the roll, but it all feels terrible and stiff. Even with the PSP's hardware limitations, the blueprint was kind of right there. How could they not just copy and paste what already worked? Then we move on to the character redesigns. There are only 3 main returning characters in this game, that being Jak, Kira, and Daxter. Daxter looks mostly the same, but Jak and Kira have this strange glossy claymation look to them that is straight up the stuff of nightmares. They just don't look like how the characters were from the original trilogy. And I get character redesigns moving from different hardware, but this is almost insulting, I think. But mentioning Daxter, probably the biggest sin that this game commits is the creation of Jak Daxter. Not only are these sections of the game pretty forced with some really cringy dialogue, but they're also just not enjoyable. The top-down beat-em-up sections feel boring, and the camera, I think, just is a cherry on top. But the biggest issue is how this affects the established lore of the universe. In Jak 3, we learn that the Dark Makers are precursors who were exposed to too much dark eco and are mutated into these creatures. Daxter was already transformed into an Ottsel, a precursor, by dark eco in the first game. So turning him into this giant Hulk-like monster whenever the story needs, it just feels like the developers really didn't understand or even respect the lore of the previous games. Beyond the lore issues, the overall story itself is a bit of a mixed bag. The core premise actually starts off pretty promising. The world is running out of eco, forcing Jak and Kira to travel to the edge of the planet in search of a solution. It feels like a natural reason to explore new locations and expand this already crazy world. But unfortunately, the execution just does not land. The new characters like the Sky Pirates and Duke Skyheed just do not have the same charisma or impact as the villains from the original trilogy. Let's just compare the game's villain to Baron Praxis, a villain whose presence loomed over every single mission in Jak 2. The dialogue also just lacks that sharp, witty humor that made the original games so memorable. Now, whilst I can appreciate the dedication the developers put into the flying aspect of this game, I really found it took up way too much of the game's actual runtime. The plane customization was actually a really cool idea, but I ended up asking myself, is spending all of this time upgrading my plane worth it when the actual combat itself feels pretty clunky and repetitive? Take towards the middle of the game, where you have to stop 3 giant missiles by repeating the same objective over and over again. It just becomes really tedious and feels like it goes on for too long. And that's not the only repetitive flying mission as well. The land combat also took a massive step backwards. We went from Jak 3's impressive 12 weapons back down to 4 weapons, just like Jak 2. They brought back the scattergun, the blaster, and the Vulcan from the previous games, but then for some bizarre reason, they made the 4th weapon a green eco grenade launcher. This is incredibly confusing. A green eco has always been associated with life and healing, and to put it on the 4th weapon, the big bad weapon that's on the same level as the Peacekeeper, makes no sense within this already established world. So you're probably asking, does this game do anything right? Surprisingly, I think it does. The first thing that comes to my mind is was the return of colored eco powers from the original Precursor legacy. I really do think that this was such a missed opportunity in Jak 2 and 3. Eco was such a crucial part of the first game's identity, and it was nice to see it return here. I loved being able to combine these powers in pretty unique ways, from the slow down time or even the rolly ball shield. It really did feel like I had multiple ways to approach situations instead of just relying on the beam reflector like in Jak 3. However, I will say that some of these powers don't really make sense. The jump boost being tied to yellow eco, sure, that makes sense, I can see that. But green eco being able to form these crystal-like structures so you can cross a gap, I don't think this has ever been shown anywhere else in the series or even the lore. Personally, I think it would have made more sense if it was something like trees or vines growing out of the environment to create these platforms. But besides that, the eco powers were a really cool addition. I also really enjoyed the light RPG elements they added into the game with the upgrades in Kira. Even though a lot of the upgrades were pretty useless, they did give me a sense of progression outside of the scripted upgrades that you get throughout the story. So when I step back after replaying and analyzing this game again, I think The Lost Frontier's terrible reputation mostly comes down to that of context. This was a follow-up to one of the greatest platforming trilogies in gaming history. If this wasn't a Jak and Daxter game, it probably just would have been remembered as a middle-of-the-road 5 out of 10 PSP action platformer. But because this game carries the Jak and Daxter name, the expectations were so much higher, and every flaw feels 10 times worse than I think it probably is. My final assessment is that The Lost Frontier isn't a terrible 1 out of 10 game. It's just a really, really disappointing Jak and Daxter game. But that's just my opinion, and I really do want to hear what other people think. Do you agree with my final assessment, or do you think that this game is just genuinely terrible and there's not a single saving grace there? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.